Well, an email question here from Francesca. She writes, a lot of people are compelled to hold the Sabbath. John 14 says, keep my commandments. Mark chapter 2, Jesus says he is Lord of the Sabbath. These are the passages people use to say that we are compelled to keep the Sabbath. So what does this all mean? Well, Francesca, thanks for your question. It's a great one. You know, first of all, when Jesus says he's Lord of the Sabbath, he is actually saying that he's Lord over the Sabbath, that he's not subject to the Sabbath, that he's free from a Sabbath. And the context there is that his disciples are pulling grain out of the ground on the Sabbath day, and I assume they were eating it. And there were complainers about that. You know how religious people get. They find that you're involved in some sort of infraction against some law or regulation, and the next thing you know, they're whining about it and complaining about it. Well, these complainers came to Jesus and said, hey, why are your disciples doing this on the Sabbath? That's illegal. They're not supposed to. And in that context, Jesus actually says that he himself is not subject to the Sabbath. He's Lord of it. And then he goes on to say that man was not made for the Sabbath, meaning that man is not subject to the Sabbath, that the whole purpose of Sabbath anyway was to rest and relax. And so if someone didn't want to rest or relax, that was their business. They weren't living under or being subject to or being a slave to a Sabbath day. So this was a new idea that Jesus was introducing, and I'm sure it was a shocker to many people. So the idea that today we're sort of compelled or obligated or required to keep a Sabbath day, well, nothing could be further from the truth. The Apostle Paul actually warns against that. He says he's fearful that people have missed the point of the gospel. You're observing days and months and years, a new moon festival, a Sabbath day. These things were just a shadow, and the reality is Christ. What he means is the reality is not resting on a certain day. The reality is resting in Jesus Christ, in his finished work. Remember that God created the world and then he rested. Remember that Jesus died on the cross and rose again, and he said it was finished. It's a finished work. So for us to rest today, we're doing what God did. We're resting in God's accomplishment. Well, we can do that as we recognize the cross and the resurrection and rest in the sufficiency of all that Jesus did for us. So in that way, it was a symbol, a shadow, a picture of what was to come, and that is resting in Christ. So we're not compelled to keep a Sabbath. In John 14, when Jesus is talking about his commandments, he's talking about his commandments, Francesca. That is his commandments, not the commandments brought in through Moses. So you need to remember that. Otherwise, my goodness, people can take the word commandments out of context, and the next thing you know, they're pushing 613 Jewish regulations telling you that Jesus said to keep his commandments. Well, remember in the New Testament that the Apostle John tells us these are his commands: to believe in Jesus, to love others even as he has loved us. And then he even goes on to say in 1 John that his commands are not burdensome. So this is very different from the law. Under the Old Testament law, there were many things that were burdensome, 613 regulations in total. So someone who is taking John 14 and Jesus' mention of his commands and then somehow spinning that into referring to Moses and the commands of the law, well, nothing could be further from the truth. Jesus even said, a new command I give you. He was in the business of bringing new commands and a new covenant and a new way of living under God's grace. Well, Francesca, thanks for your question via social media. I'm glad you brought it to the program.